Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Carger People in Science Live, streaming right now across LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. I'm Francesca Brazzarotto, your host today, and I'm so excited you're here with us. Whether you're tuning in from the world of research, clinical practice, or academia, or simply curious about the science behind what makes us tick, you're in for a fascinating session. Today, we are diving deep into the psychology of habits, those automatic behaviors that quietly shape our days and ultimately our lives. And to guide us through this journey, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Professor Benjamin Gardner, a distinguished psychologist from the University of Surrey. He's one of the world's leading experts in the science of habitual behavior, with nearly 200 publications to his name, including over 70 focused on habits alone. He also leads the university's Sustainability Through Behavior Change initiative and directs their Master in Behavior Change program. So, why do some habits stick and others don't? Can we really change our behavior just by forming new routines? And how do habits relate to things like self-control, intention, and even sustainability? Let's find out. And if you're watching live, feel free to drop your own questions or comments in the chat. We'll try to bring a few of them into the conversation as we go. So, Professor Gardner, thank you so much for being with us today. Welcome.
Thank you.
To kick things off, I'd love to go back to the beginning. What first drew you to the study of habits and behavior change? Was there a personal experience or a specific moment that sparked your interest in the field?
Yeah, so I did my PhD many years ago in traffic and transport psychology. So the main thing I was interested in is why would people choose to drive when they've got alternative options, so kind of sustainability focused. And the main approaches that I was using at first in that were all based on kind of deliberative models, which suggest that we do things because we've deliberately chosen to do something, we've formed a kind of conscious intention, we've planned to do it. And then a kind of eminent researcher in the field of habits came along and gave a talk to our department where he was talking all about how much of our behavior is habitual. And a lot of the research that had been done on habits in the mid-90s in social psychology was done in travel mode choice. So a lot of what he was talking about was, habits as it related to my particular area. So there was that obvious connection. But the other thing that struck me was when he was talking about, habits are things we do automatically without thinking, without knowing what we're doing. I was really just kind of puzzled because I just thought I can't see how that really fully relates to to the real world. Because, at that time I was cycling to the university campus and there was never a point where I just felt, crikey, what am I doing? I didn't realize I'd got on my bike or, I don't know where I am or anything like that. But at the same time, it struck a chord to say, yes, there's definitely some element of doing things kind of instinctively here. But it really just made me think, what is this notion of habit and how does it actually play out in the real world in relation to real world behaviors? And essentially my entire career has been focused on trying to make sense of this concept habit and to make it relate to, real world experience.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's fascinating. And so thank you for sharing that. So let's build on that and go a bit deeper into the concept itself. So could you clarify what exactly a habit is and how does it differ from similar concepts we often hear about, like habitual behavior, routine, or even, a ritual or a personality?
Yeah, well, I mean, even this is a contentious subject. You'd think that, everyone talks about habits, so we all know what they are. But actually, we can distinguish between two different kind of clusters of definition of habit. There's habit as it's used in everyday language to refer to things that we do that we've kind of settled into a pattern of doing. They're quite predictable. Maybe we don't need to think about doing them. And then there's the psychologist definition of habit, which is based on this notion of automaticity, doing something in a situation because you're prompted by something in the environment to do something that you've learned to do in the past in that particular environment. Now, even within the psychological definition, among psychologists, there are disagreements regarding how we should best define habit. And there's no kind of inherently right or wrong definition. But probably the most straightforward way that I like to think of it is that a habit is an association that we have somewhere, in our brains, in our minds, between a particular aspect of the environment and a thing that we do in that environment. And the way that this habit works is when we go into that environment, it automatically generates a kind of non-conscious impulse for us to do the thing that we normally do. So, to give an example, when I get into my office in the morning, I go and make a cup of tea. Now,
Mhm.
it's a very mundane behavior, but it's based on this simple association. As soon as I get through my office door, I'm prompted to pick up my cup and go and make a cup of tea. So there, the habit is the association between getting into the office and the behavior of going to make a cup of tea. Now, one thing that I think is really important for understanding habit is that the habit is the association between those two things. The habitual behavior is the thing that you do because of that habit. So I have
Okay.
an association between getting into my office and going to make a cup of tea, and that then produces the habitual behavior of making a cup of tea. And we'll probably cover this later, but I think the reason that's important is once we can distinguish habit from behavior and see habit as a cause of behavior rather than a type of behavior, that's where things get interesting. Because then we can think about habits that people have that maybe they don't do often, or behaviors that people do often that aren't necessarily done out of habit. So just to
Wow.
clarify, the habit is based on an association. Habit is an association between a cue and a behavior that we do in response to that cue.
Oh wow. Okay, that's very clear now what we mean by those two terms. Okay, so it's all based on the environment. Then you mentioned and the connection between the environment and an action, how we react to that with an action.
Yeah, yeah, so probably the way to think of it is that, if you're in a completely new situation and you don't know what to do, the behavior that you do, yes, it will be kind of framed by what's available to you in the environment, but you have to go through a conscious thought process. You have to think, what should I do here in this situation that I find myself in? But if you repeatedly do something when you encounter that cue, so for me, for example, because I repeatedly made tea when I get into my office, this association strengthens. And what happens is you essentially delegate control over the start of an action from these conscious processes onto the environment. So you get to a stage where your environment can trigger you to do things automatically, or at least kind of present the option of doing something by default to you. And if you don't fight that
Mhm.
habit, you will just go and do that behavior.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So that is tricky as well, because you kind of look back at even unconsciously, you look back at things that you have done in the past in that specific situation, or something similar situation, and just apply kind of the same rules, right? And then you can build on top of that if you don't realize it and you keep doing it. So let's talk about how we think and talk about habits. So often we hear about good and bad habits, but that raises the question: what actually makes a habit good or bad? Is it about the outcomes? Is it about intention? Something else entirely? And we said something is unconscious, so we don't really know that happens sometimes. And how should we think about this when we're trying to design or change a behavior, especially in the health context?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question because as I understand it, as I'm defining it, this habit being an association between a cue and a response, that in itself is entirely neutral. Habits,
Mhm.
habit as a kind of mechanism or as an idea is neither good nor bad. What makes a habit good or bad is whether the behavior that you do out of habit is something you want to do or something you don't want to do, or something that's socially desirable or something that's
Mhm.
socially undesirable. Um, so one example I sometimes give, we all learned during the COVID pandemic that we had to sneeze into our elbows rather than into our hands, for example.
Yes.
But then if someone has the habit of sneezing into their hands, is that a good habit or is it a bad habit? Well, if the alternative is that they sneeze into, a crowded room full of people, well, that's bad because that is a negative outcome for most people, in which case then the action of doing it into their hands is better. So then that's a good habit.
Mhm.
But then you could say, well, actually, if their default is to sneeze into their hands, then actually that's a bad habit relative to the habit of sneezing into their elbow, which is a better outcome. But essentially, in all of this, I think to think of whether habits are good or bad, just take the word habit out and just refer to behavior. Is the behavior
Mhm.
a good behavior or a bad behavior? That's where things get subjective. But I think habits are neither good nor bad. Having said that, though, habit is an inherently useful. It's really useful that we have habits because it allows us to do the things that we often do, and so we need to do often
Mhm.
without thinking about them. Because imagine if when you woke up in the morning, you had no habits and no kind of defaults stored anywhere, you would be kind of paralyzed from all the decisions you have to make. You'd wake up and think, right, what do I do next? And then you decide, well, it's probably good to get up. Okay, where do I go now? Well, I should probably go to the bathroom. What should I do now I'm in here? But we have these habits because it helps us to, for most of us, when we get up, we're thinking about the things we're going to do later that day, rather than thinking about, shall I walk here? Shall I go in this room? What shall I do in this room? And by doing that, it means we can think about other things that are more meaningful and actually deserve our attention, rather than, shall I now walk into this room, or shall I go here? Shall I tie my laces on my left shoe or on my right shoe? So habits are really useful. The problem is that because these habits become so ingrained in what we do, if we decide that we no longer want to do a particular behavior, often that habit will keep us doing it even though we don't want to do it. And that's what we can think of as a bad habit, something we know we shouldn't do, but we're finding it hard to stop doing.
Yeah, so it's kind of the comfort zone, right? You do a series of things because you're used to it, and you are basically safe, and you can think about something else, and control your energy, and focus on something else, which is a good thing. But as you said, yeah, then there are some part of that comfort zone that might be not so beneficial, especially when it comes to health. And for example, you wake up and prepare a cup of tea. Somebody might wake up and smoke a cigarette, and then have a coffee and connect the coffee with the cigarette, and then that connects to other things. So let's talk about how habits actually stick. So many people think that once something becomes habit, or an habitual behavior, it's automatic and permanent. But I think your research suggests that it's not always that simple, and not always that straightforward. So can you walk us through when habit formation, or stacking, as it's been called sometimes, and when it might not be enough?
Yeah, so this is where habits get really interesting, and this is why it's advantageous to see a habit as an association rather than a behavior. Because if you see habit as a behavior, then by definition, if you formed a habit, you will keep doing the behavior, and if you stop doing it, you've broken the habit. But actually, what habit does when we form these habits, these associations, is that means that when we go into the situation that is stored as part of that association, we automatically, not consciously, but we non-consciously kind of experience an impulse to do the thing that we normally do. But we can overcome that impulse if we like. So, for example, 3 years ago, I started up a new habit of doing an exercise routine every morning. And I had it, in the summer months, it was great. I'd wake up, the first thing I'd do, go downstairs, do a YouTube workout. So I quickly developed this habit that as soon as I woke up, I would go and do this particular behavior. But then there came a time when I got really busy at work. I had, marking to do, for example. And then I started thinking, well, actually, I could do my workout now, or I could get a bit of my work done, and then I'd prefer to do my workout later in the day. So I made a conscious choice to override that habit. That doesn't mean I broke the habit, because each morning I'd wake up and the first thing that came to mind was do a workout. But then I'd think, no, I'll do that later. So the habit put that idea into my head, but I consciously thought, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do something else. So what this tells us is that when we think about building a new habit, forming a habit, whatever it is, actually what we're talking about is creating a kind of a default option, creating a tendency to be pushed towards doing the thing that we normally do in that situation. That's not the same as saying that we will always do it, because we can override it if we really want to, and if we've got the resources to do so. So it means that having a habit won't necessarily be enough, because if there are constantly other things that are higher priority, you might still have that habit telling you to do something, but you might start overriding that habit, and so you stop doing the behavior, or you interrupt doing the behavior. So habit formation is important, but it's not necessarily everything you need to keep doing that particular behavior.
Okay, so you need intention to go along with that.
Yes, pretty much. I mean, you need an intention of some sort. And again, where things get interesting is where you think, well, actually, for me, with my workout, for example, there have been times when I've woken up and thought, oh, I really can't be bothered. Now, what habit is really useful for here is it can fill in where your motivation is temporarily low. So overall, I still wanted to do a workout, but in that particular moment, I couldn't be bothered. But because I had a habit, I started getting up and just did my workout anyway. So that what we're talking about here is habits can help fill in. It can help us do a behavior that we generally want to do, but at that moment, maybe that desire isn't so strong. But if we very, very strongly don't want to do the habitual behavior, we won't necessarily do it. And another example of this is, however strong this habit of exercising may be, or let's say something like biting your nails, right? People may have habits for biting their nails, and they might say, I find it really difficult to stop. If someone put a gun to their head and said, you have to stop for the next 24 hours, or actually, let's make this more pleasant. If they said, I'll give you €1 million if you don't do this for the next day, you'd be able to stop yourself from doing it because you'd very strongly not want to do it. The issue with habit is, in our everyday lives, often our intentions at a particular moment aren't as strong as they could be, or something else is distracting us. And this is why we can end up acting in line with habits, even if we generally don't want to do them, because something's gone on to distract us, or our motivation has been temporarily weakened a bit, and so on.
Okay, it's just very interesting because when I think about habits, sometimes I tend to always look at the negative side of the word. I know that it's habitual behavior and not an habit, but that's, I think, a lot of people associated with when they think about habits, because sometimes you find yourself doing things you're not even thinking about. As you said, I just pick the bike and just go and cycle to work, and I don't ask myself why. But sometimes you just bite your nails, you don't realize it's just a cue because you're in a stressful situation, you don't even realize, right? So that's what I find really fascinating, how to kind of rewire yourself so that these things don't happen, even if they are unconscious, and you do them without realizing. Is there a trick that you can apply to this rewiring?
Not really. I think, again, it's just we need to rethink how we think about habits. I mean, that when you said about how we often think of habits as being bad, it reminds me that again, we have these two different definitions. We've got the psychological definition of associations, then we've got the kind of public lay definition of
Yes.
things that we do often. And often people will use the habit as an excuse. They'll say, "Oh, sorry, I did that. I've just got a terrible habit of doing that." But actually, this is why it's useful to have this psychological definition, because if our definition of habit is just something you do often, well, if someone says, "Sorry, I did that. I have a habit," they're saying, "Sorry, I did that. I do that." So, it's not an explanation for anything. It's no legitimate excuse. But this is where psychology is helpful, in that we need to think, okay, the reason that I've done this thing that I didn't want to do, or, has harmed someone else, or whatever it is because I have this association. Something's gone on in my environment which has stopped me from paying attention to what I'm doing. Therefore, I acted in line with an association. It's quite long-winded, but that's a better way to think of it. So I think having that knowledge of why we do some of the things we do, and knowing that we're almost, I don't want to say we're victims of our environment, but a lot of what we do isn't because we've consciously decided to do it. It's just that something's come up. We haven't even noticed that it's come up, but it's prompted us to do the thing that we normally do. That's kind of empowering, because it makes you realize, actually, what you might need to do to change your behavior is think about, can you modify part of that environment so you're not triggered anymore? Or can you identify what the environment is and stop yourself acting? There are lots of different ways to change your behavior that you unlock when you start to realize, actually, that's a habit that I'm doing.
And somebody asked about habit stacking. So I also mentioned it earlier. Maybe there's something you can explain for those that are not familiar with the term, and how can it help, or if there's a limit to how beneficial it can be.
Yeah, sure. So habit stacking is the idea of building habits upon existing habits. And I mean, you asked me way back at the start of this conversation, how does a habit relate to a routine? Just to answer this, I think I see routines as sequences of behaviors that may be facilitated by these habit associations, but they may not be. They may have elements where, if you've got a long routine between waking up in the morning and getting to work, there'll be elements of that are helped by these habit associations. There'll be other elements that are helped by, you're consciously deciding what to do. Now, the thing is, within these routines, we do have fairly set ways of doing things. So, if you get the train to work, for example, you probably stand in exactly the same place on the platform each time and that kind of thing. So habit stacking is a way of thinking, actually, to change my behavior, I'm not going to do something completely unrealistic and say, I'm going to completely change what I do. What I'm going to do is try and work a new habit into my existing routine. And in principle, that's a really good idea because you've got all of the kind of mental structure in place. If you've got a strong routine, if you've got a sequence of habits, that's great because you've already got something that you can insert the new habit into. So great, you've got everything in place, go for it. The danger is, though, the problem is that if you have a sequence of habits or a fairly strong routine, well, it can be difficult to remember to put the new habit into that. So it has its kind of its advantages and its disadvantages. But we do know, as psychologists, we know that we have strategies, we have tips and tricks to help people to remember to do the things that they want to do within particular sequences. Just setting yourself a plan, setting reminders, mentally thinking through what situation will you find yourself in when you want to do this new thing, and will it work to do it in that order. So if you can do that, if you can think through exactly how you're going to do it, then habit stacking is a very useful thing to do. Now, on to the next part of the question: can you stack loads of habits? I mean, in theory, yes. And, come to think of it, a lot of our day-to-day life is essentially habit stacking, isn't it? Because if you compare how you live now with how you were as a child, you probably live a completely different day-to-day routine, and it's because you've gradually put more things into that routine, and now you've got quite set routines that are quite different to what you did before. So I think it is possible to stack multiple habits, but I think it's not advisable to try to do too many at once, because then you've got a lot of remembering to do. If you've got a sequence of 10 things that you do, in theory it's relatively straightforward to insert thing number 11 into the middle of that sequence, say, but it's going to be hard to put things number 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15 into the correct sequence. So I think work on number 11 first. Once that's part of your routine, then put in number 12 and so on. So I think habit stacking will work if it's done in a gradual way.
Right, makes sense. And yeah, from my point of view, I tend to have a lot of habits stacked on top of each other, especially in the morning. And sometimes, by the end of the day, it's one big stack of habits, to be honest, now that I think about it. And as I said, most of them are unconscious. But what about habit substitution? So where we try and change one of these habits that might be not that beneficial to us. How does that work? And how can we enforce it if the new habit is not as rewarding as the other one that we're trying to change?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. I mean, first of all, just to explain what habit substitution is. So when it comes to breaking a habit, I see the concept of habit substitution where you've got this quite strong association between a cue and a response. Habit substitution involves two things. It involves what we call habit inhibition. So this is making sure that you don't do the part of that habit that you don't want to do anymore, and the formation of a new habit. So you're stopping yourself from doing something that you've got a habit for doing, an old habit, and instead you're doing a new habit in its place. Now, of all the ways to break habits, and maybe we'll come on to this later, there are multiple ways that we could be said to be breaking a habit. But of all the potential ways to do this, habit substitution in theory is the best thing to do because it involves directly targeting the association at the heart of the habit. You're trying to it's thought that you can't overwrite, you can't undo associations that you have, but what you can do is form new associations that will compete with the old one. So let's say, for example, I have this habit of going to make tea when I get into my office. Let's say I really want to drink hot water instead because I decide that's better for me. In theory, if I continually make sure I don't make tea, I have hot water instead, I should be able to form a new habit of having hot water that overrides the old one. And so overall, you'd say I now have a hot water habit rather than a tea habit. So yeah, that's how habit substitution works. Sorry, I've lost what your question was. Can you remind me?
No, I was just thinking, like, maybe is there any tips you can give maybe to find another habit or another behavior that is similar to the one you're trying to substitute, and maybe find it as similar as possible so that the substitution is not that hard. So instead of having, the tea bags right there on the kitchen counter, you only have a glass and the water. And so that makes it easier for you to have a new habit. Would that
Yes, yeah,
work?
of course. Yeah, you were talking about the rewarding value. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I think there are lots of things you need to do in order to substitute one habit for another. I mean, before we even come on to the rewarding value, one thing you need to do is really become aware that you have a habit and what the cue is to that habit. If you, I think we talk a lot in psychology about the importance of self-monitoring, monitoring the behavior that you do. But I think something else that's really important for habits is cue monitoring or environment monitoring, not only recording, did you do the behavior, but where were you? Who were you with? What were you doing immediately beforehand and so on? And if we keep that kind of record for a decent amount of time, it might only be, I don't know, a week or so, actually you'll start to realize there is a pattern here. And you may not have realized it before, but it seems that the thing that prompts you to do this thing you don't want to do is X. And once you know what X is, what the cue is, then you can start thinking, right, what am I going to do instead? And what situation do I need to do this new thing? Then onto the topic of the rewarding value of the behavior, I think this is where a lot of habit substitution attempts kind of fall. The problem is that a lot of the time we have what we think of as bad habits because the habitual behaviors we do are very rewarding in some way. If you think of something like I don't know, eating a bar of chocolate, it's designed to kind of really stimulate your taste buds, and it's a pleasant experience. Whereas if you say, actually, I'm going to eat an apple instead, it's probably not as tasty. Let's not say it too loud. So actually, I think what you do need to do is, you definitely need to find something that will kind of meet the same. It will have the same kind of impact, or it will be as close as possible in terms of its rewarding value to the thing that you're trying to stop doing. And having said all of that, though, I think the really important thing is to make sure you don't just say, I will not do this. So if you have chocolate every day at 2 p.m., don't say to yourself, right, I'm just going to stop doing it. Because based on this habit association, if it's 2 p.m., you'll be triggered. There'll be this impulse in you to eat chocolate. And if you haven't got anything else prepared, you're just going to be thinking, I could eat some chocolate right now. And then it gets stronger and stronger until you just start really consciously feeling like, I need to have some chocolate. So it's better to have another food in mind, than to have nothing planned. But yeah, this is where it's really difficult because some behaviors are just inherently more rewarding than others.
Absolutely. Oh, that is so good to know that it's important maybe not to say no, but to substitute with something else instead. Just make something else available to replace the old behavior. When we're talking about chocolates, something similar, but do not say no, otherwise we'll make things more complicated for you. And I think just from what I can understand, obviously we are reacting to our environment, but also it goes really deeper into who we are and the kind of stimulus we get from the environment, but also our past experiences, right? So we are reacting to emotions, we are reacting to all this kind of stuff. So it's not something to be treated lightly, like an habit. It could go really deep, right? And that's
Well,
fascinating thing.
yeah, that's a really interesting point, because on the one hand, habit is something, it's quite a simple idea. It's just that you formed an association between a cue and a behavior. But the way to think of it is the habits that we have are legacies of decisions that we made in the past. And so then if you want to change that habit, often you will need to think, why did I start doing that in the first place? So that's where that's where you might start thinking, okay, well, I've got to reevaluate what, if it's biting your nails, for example, why do I bite my nail? What was it that actually got me into that situation? Because I think if you just think, oh, okay, I'll stop myself from doing it. I've realized it's when I get stressed that I get the feeling, the urge to do it. I don't think that's enough. So I think in order to understand reward value, yeah, you're right. You need to think about, well, why is this behavior so rewarding to me? And so that will help you to choose another reward. But that's the bit where it gets quite deep. In a way, the habit part isn't so deep. It's just, well, it's a cue behavior association. But the reason you formed that association is probably for kind of deeper, there's a deeper meaning and reason behind that behavior in the first place.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's a question here that ties in very nicely in a way. So Marco says, building on the concept of the environment as a powerful cue in the habit loop, how can we effectively change a behavior that's triggered by an environment that we cannot easily alter?
Okay, so this goes back to this notion of breaking habits. So
Mm,
I mean, I've talked about habit substitution, but in our
mm.
work, we've identified uh, 4 different ways in which you can break a habit, or you could be said to be breaking a habit.
Okay.
So, as I said, if you think of a kind of diagram where you've got a habit that leads to habitual behavior, then actually one way in which you can be said to have broken the habit is to successfully stop yourself from doing something.
Mhm.
Personally, I would have thought this is, probably the worst of all those options. It's probably the worst one because it's literally just saying, okay, think of when you're going to do it and then tell yourself you're not going to do it. However, research from Professor Wendy Wood in the University of Southern California, she published a paper in 2010 suggesting actually among students who were trying not to do things that they didn't want to do but that they had habits for doing, actually this notion of vigilant monitoring, look out for the situation and stop yourself from doing it, they found that the most effective way of stopping themselves acting on
Mhm.
habits. So one thing you can do is this notion of what we call habit inhibition. Try and identify what it is that triggers you and then stop yourself from doing it. The other thing that you can do is, if you know what the trigger is to this behavior, try and avoid the trigger.
Mm.
If you know that it's when you see friends that certain friends that you're going to want to smoke cigarettes, well, could you maybe spend less time with them? Could you try and avoid them for a while until you've broken that
Mhm.
association?
Or change the environment where you meet them so that that's not possible for any of you. Also.
Exactly. Yeah. Well. So this notion of avoiding the trigger is something that we call habit cue discontinuity. Try and discontinue your exposure to the cue. But what you've just mentioned is what we call reducing behavioral accessibility, but others
Okay.
more simply call it adding friction. If you make it harder to do that behavior
Mhm.
to the point where it's still possible to do it, but people think it's really hard, really difficult, that may stop people as well. So an example I always give is, I've got a really sweet tooth. I really like eating chocolate and cookies and so on. But if I don't have any of them in my house, what am I going to do when I'm triggered to go and have some chocolate? It will require me to go to a shop. I don't want to do that. I've got other things to do. I'm too busy. And so I've made that behavior less accessible. Yes, I still could go and get some chocolate if I want, but because it's not easy to do, I've made it prohibitively difficult. So
Mhm.
that's the kind of thing that you can do, is try and kind of put your own barriers into the environment that make it harder for you to do it, or try and avoid that environment. Or if you can't do either of those things, just try and tell yourself you're not going to do it. Work out which environments trigger it and then try and ready your willpower so that you'll be able to stop yourself. And then the fourth way is what we've talked about before, which is habit substitution, which
Mhm.
is a kind of better version of habit inhibition. Stop yourself from doing it and do something instead.
Amazing. Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing these tips. I hope everybody's taking notes. I am. And so you explained these 4 ways that we can do it as well. And are there any myths out there that you love to bust? I mean, there's the story of the 21 days to create an habit or have a new habit. Is that real? Are there any other myths around the habits formation or breaking that is not true at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the 21 days thing is the biggest myth. And there are
Okay,
there are
great.
lots of different levels of kind of mythness about it and kind of inaccuracy. Um, but years ago, I looked into this to find out, where does this 21 days come from? And
Mhm.
actually I traced it to a book that was written by a plastic surgeon from America in I think it was the late 1960s, where he said
Okay.
among his plastic surgery patients, it tends to take them 3 weeks to get used to their new appearance. And then he said, when I moved house, clearly this guy had money, because when he talked about, every time he moved house,
Yeah.
he would take about 3 weeks to get used to living there. And as far
Okay.
as I know, that is the evidence base for 21 days. And in fact, what's interesting about that is, to a psychologist, that's what we call habituation, which is becoming desensitized to something, getting used to something. That's not anything to do, well, it's only kind of tangentially related to this notion of developing new associations. So all of
Mm.
that comes from that one source, it seems. But there's a now kind of very famous study that a colleague of mine did, that suggested that So in this study, this was based on 96 people who were recruited on the basis that they wanted to do a new behavior. So it was a dietary behavior or a
Mhm.
physical activity behavior. And they were brought into a lab and they were asked to form plans of when they would do this behavior once a day, and only once a day, but every day. And every day for the next 12 weeks, they had to report whether they did the behavior or not on the previous day. And if they did, how automatic did it feel? In other words, how habitual. And
Mhm.
what that study actually showed was every person seemed to take a different amount of time to get to their maximum habit strength. But the average amount of time that it took people to get to their maximum level of habit strength was 66 days. So
Oh, wow.
nowadays, if you Google how long does it take to form a habit, you tend to get this 66 days thing. But
Hmm.
that comes with a heavy kind of caveat that actually that was just the medium value among 96 people. One
Mm.
person reached their peak in 18 days. Someone else didn't reach their peak at all in 12 weeks, but it was forecast if they kept going, after 254 days, they'd get there. Um, and another, sorry, you've really touched on a bugbear of mine. Another issue with this study is actually, if you think of it, it's really difficult to dichotomize habit. It's really difficult to say this person has a habit and this person doesn't have a habit,
Mm.
because habit becomes more strong over time. It's not the case that, if you do something once a day, every day, it's not the case that one day you just feel like, wow, today's completely different. And I'm doing this entirely automatically. And yesterday I wasn't. What will tend to happen is you start to feel like, actually, yeah, this is becoming part of what I do. And in some of my work, I found that people tend to report within, say, 2 weeks of doing something every day, they tend to start saying, yeah, this is feeling like it's part of my routine now. So that's where we'd say it looks like habit has started to form, but it's really difficult to say, how long does it take to get to that point? Because that will differ according to the thing that it is that people are trying to do. That's the behavior,
Mhm.
properties of the person who's trying to do it, properties of the environment they're trying to do it in. So yes, 21 days is the biggest kind of myth that I think that's out there. But I think the second, maybe it's harsh to call it a myth, but I think the second point that I think is really important is, as I said earlier, this notion of habit not being the same as behavior. And you can have a habit, but you don't necessarily act on it. So going back
Mhm.
to my workout, yes, I still have a habit for doing a workout, but I very rarely do it in the morning. So I have a morning workout habit, but actually my behavior is quite different to that now. So that's where I think it goes back to your question of, if you've got a habit, will you keep doing the behavior forever? I think that's one of the biggest myths. And actually, when you've got a
Okay.
habit, that's great. That will keep you on track, but you're going to probably need a bit more to keep you going and keep you on track on top of that habit.
Wow. Okay. That's thank you for busting those myths. It's very interesting, and I think there's a few comments in the chat that prove that people knew about this. And somebody said, "Well, I never reached the 21 days, so that's good." Um, but I'm just thinking we've chatted to different researchers and professors and doctors, and we saw differences in their research between people from different backgrounds, people from different parts of the world, ethnicities. Do you see the same thing when it comes to the study of habits? Do you see differences in, yeah, also getting a new habit going or breaking habits? Is there different, or are we all the same?
Well, I mean, I should say I haven't done a great deal of research outside what we call the weird community, white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So I can't talk about this in terms of my own research, but I do know that what we're trying to understand here is a fundamental human process that I think everyone has. Because as I said, you could observe anyone in their natural environment and find that they're doing things without having to think about them,
Mm.
because they've learned to do it. I mean, take something like tying your shoelaces. You don't think, what shall I do? Oh, I've got this lace in this hand and so on. You just do it in that particular way. So I think the notion of habit is a fundamental kind of universe. It's a fundamental human kind of mechanism that we all have. I think if we did find that there were differences in terms of demographics or cultures or anything, those differences would be in the behaviors that people are doing, possibly how rewarding they are
Mhm.
within that particular context. But the habit itself, this construct that helps us to learn to do things in appropriate environments, I think that's universal.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that. And we have, I'm conscious of time. We have two questions here. Let's see if we can answer one or both. So the first one is, in fast-paced work environments where routines are constantly disrupted, how can we design habits that are both adaptable and resilient without losing consistency or purpose?
Wow,
Quite
that's a
a,
big question.
yeah, it's a big one.
I
Do
think
we have a short answer?
so. Yeah, I'll try and be brief. So I think in this situation, the thing that you have to make habitual will be quite an abstract behavior. So I've talked about very specific behaviors like tying your shoelaces. Um, we can think about other behaviors that people do supposedly, or, out of habit, like going to work. And actually going to work is a much kind of what we call like a higher order behavior. It's far broader, it's more vague than the act of tying your laces. And there's been recent research which suggests that people can form habits based on these so-called higher order behaviors. In other words, habits for doing quite broad behaviors. So I'm thinking particularly of a study that was done on encouraging people to form the habit of putting vegetables onto their dinner plate each evening.
Mhm.
Now, actually, that's a great habit to form because it's good for you, they're vegetables, but actually there's some flexibility in there at the same time. Which vegetables? Well, it's up to you. So the way that that habit works is, if you kind of form this higher order habit, as they're called, what will happen is you'll go into that situation of, you're about to serve your dinner, or you're making your dinner, or whatever it is, and then the thing that will come to mind, the impulse that will be generated, will be to have vegetables. But then you've got the flexibility to think, okay, but which vegetables am I going to have?
Mhm.
So yeah, I think we can form these higher order habits. So that's the way that we can have set ways of doing things, but we have flexibility in how we do them. And the same applies to workplaces, and the same applies to my own like workout routine. I will do a different workout routine on different days. The thing that's habitual is this kind of this
That you're
impulse
working
to
on.
do a workout, but exactly
Mhm.
what I do can differ. And I think that's probably the best way to go about doing it, because if you simply did exactly the same thing in the same way each time for something that you'd want to enjoy, like doing a workout, you're not going to stick at it. So I think form these more vague, higher order habits, and that will keep you going.
Perfect. Thank you so much for answering this. We also have another question, and I just want to go back very quickly to what you were saying. Connected to the health environment and the health outcome. Are should doctors, like practitioners, start using this kind of behavioral changes with patients? Because it's easy to go to a doctor, say, well, you're overweight and things like that, you have to cut sugar. But shouldn't they start trying, maybe talking to patients, saying, well, actually you could create a series of new habits to make sure that you lose weight? Or is that already happening? Or
Yeah, no, certainly that's what people should do. And I think the thing to take from this idea of habits is that by trying to change someone's behavior by targeting their habits or talking to them about habits, you're going beyond just saying why they should change their behavior and actually giving them some guidance on how. So
Mm,
yes, in terms of, if you're a doctor and you want people to eat better, maybe because they're overweight, what doctors will traditionally do is say, okay, well, you're overweight, have you thought about changing your diet? But actually, if you could go further and say, have you thought about changing your diet? Here's one specific thing, or think of a situation that you find yourself in each day, and then repeatedly do the behavior that you want to do. You'd have to make it specific to people.
mhm, of
But I
course,
think
yeah.
this idea of tailoring it to environments that people find themselves in, and then behaviors they want to do in that environment, I think by doing that you empower people to make these changes. So yeah, I think definitely a habit-based approach is useful. But I think we need to point out again, I mean, the habit-based approach on its own is not a magic bullet. You can't get
Mhm.
someone who's overweight who doesn't want to change their behavior. You can't just say, okay, well, let's try changing your habit associations, because they won't put the work in to actually disrupt those associations or form new ones. The way to think about habits is you need to work with people who are already motivated, or who you can motivate. And then
Mm.
on top of that, if you can add in this kind of situation specific responding, I think that's a way to improve on merely motivating someone to want to change.
Right. Perfect. Thank you for sharing. I'm sure if any practitioner out there has listened to this, so will be trying this, hopefully with their patients. So one last question. Is there any significant difference between human and animal in adapting their new habits behavior? So we go back to research. Have you seen any of this research, or is there any research about
Yeah,
that
I
out there?
mean, well, there's loads of research. I mean, the concept of habit has traditionally been studied with, you know, rats running down mazes, and they'll carry on running down there when some chocolate that was at the end of the maze is removed. And there's a very famous study that showed that another one with rats, where rats, when they pressed a lever in their cage, occasionally they get a kind of a sugary treat out of it. And so they learn to keep pressing this lever, and it would give them intermittently these kind of rewards. And we know that that's a way of encouraging someone to kind of keep doing a behavior. If they keep doing it and every so often you get a reward, it's likely that they'll do it. And then what was shown was that actually when the rats were then injected with something that made them feel unwell when they ate these sugary treats, a lot of them persisted in pressing the lever, even though it kind of didn't serve their purposes. But yeah, I
So
mean,
like us.
yeah, well, I mean, whether that means that there's a difference between us and rats is another issue. But I mean, ultimately, those rats did adapt their behavior. The point is that it took them longer because they had these habits. So I think this is something that we need to bear in mind, that again, yeah, having a bad habit can stop you doing something, but you should be able to kind of overwrite it eventually. It's just that it will persist for longer. But yeah, I mean, the main distinction between humans and some other animals is we have that higher level kind of cognitive capacity. We can think about things and think through outcomes and think of why we want to do things. So, for example, humans have the notion of identity. We might want to do something because it helps us to express who we are or who we want to be. So in that way, you know, we may be able to change our behavior because it's helping us to feel part of a group or to define who we are, whereas a rat running down a maze doesn't. But again, I think that fundamental process of having these associations, yes, humans and animals both have them.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think this is all time we have for today. So, Professor Gardner, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing such insightful, practical, and thought-provoking perspectives. And it's been a real pleasure learning from you. And I know our audience as well will walk away with a better understanding of how habits really work and how we can build better ones. So a big thank you as well to everyone who joined us live across LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. We really appreciate your time, questions, and comments and engagement. So before we sign off, I'm excited to announce our next episode of People in Science Live happening on the 26th of May. We'll be joined by Professor Stefan Bronhuber to discuss innovative financial strategies for a resilient healthcare system, which is a timely and essential topic. And we hope you'll join us again for that conversation. But until then, thank you again, Professor Gardner.
Thank you.
And stay curious, stay informed, and see you next time. Bye.